Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. And so much, yet so little has happened since last episode. And, of course, there is a lot of speculation. We're also about a week out from the Vilnius summit, which I believe will give us a lot more insight on which way the Ukraine war is going to go for the remainder of its course, really, but especially these next few months, especially through the summer into the fall, because everyone has said, and of course this is the frame that they have to maintain, this is something they have to say so things don't get too escalatory, that Ukraine will not be in NATO, but inevitably there will be some sort of major caveat that allows whatever sort of aid, whatever sort of intervention, and involvement in Ukraine is being more deeply entrenched in these past few weeks, especially with the speculations around the Zaporizhia power plant. And we have some news out of the Middle East as well we'll touch on, and just a little bit all over that we'll get to, but a lot out of Ukraine, which I'm sure is not a surprise. So, without further ado, I'll hand it over to you to give us a little bit of an update about what's happened over the course of the past week.
Okay. Unlike last week, uh, there, uh, of course, there have been missile strikes and so on, but not in the kind of barrages that we and intensity that we've seen before. If we begin with the south, basically, since last week, most of the action that's been happening in the Kherson is concentrated around the Novokhovka dam area and Antonovsky Bridge. So this is a bridge separate from the bridge of the dam. That's totally gone. Um, One of the techniques that the Ukrainians used in order to remain there for so long, and this is uh, besides hiding underneath the bridge and using uh, basically shrubs and whatever they could to hide, is they would capture the territory, and if they had to retreat, for instance, they would have one of their like grad launchers that would cover their way back, not in front of them but behind them, so that anybody who came at them would have to go through these um, small personnel mines, right? These mines that are laid, they can cause damage to small vehicles, but they're mostly intended for people. So they mined the whole approach to the bridge, which forced the Russians to go on basically the east side of the bridge, and this gave them a lot of time to entrench themselves. I saw a video last week that was already a couple of days old, and that was a group of Russian soldiers who basically had uh, who'd been stranded, and an MPV came in, raced in. They the men got on board and they raced back without ever going on one of these mines. But you can understand there have been losses before or since then that have taken place because of this technique. And this is the technique that was used by both sides in the fighting in Zaporizhia. So that's just an interesting bit of strategy that I've picked up on in the last 2 weeks. But in any case, the Russians began hitting this area very hard. The Ukrainians retreated, then they came back again, and now they've been more or less destroyed again. And there's a small group, I think about a handful. Now there was a video of them trying to escape in boats. One of the boats was hit by a drone, and you had the image of Ukrainian soldiers that had been killed essentially by this drone. But so that's what's going on in Kherson. No attempts to take the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant by crossing it. Uh, this in any of the areas that are drying out right now, the Ukrainians have not made any attempts. Again, the Antonovsky Bridge that I'm talking about, the crossing is still done on boats, so it very much still has water, even if it's been significantly uh, decreased. So as far as the fighting on the Zaporozhye front, we'll begin from the west and Piattihatki. So Piattihatki now is under Ukrainian control, including most of the band of forest on the southwest of Piattihatki. And basically, that's where it's been for roughly the last 5, 6 days. Um, the Ukrainians have tried very hard to get into Rabotino. Um, they still have not managed to take over that village. Uh, Fighting basically in that area has been going on for, uh, uh, I would say, a solid 2 weeks. There have been very, very few changes in these areas. I'm going to send you just some maps so people have like uh, an overall idea of just how what the extent of the land that has been taken. So I'm just going to send them to you on Telegram, and I think this will give people an idea of how much land has been ceded by the Russians during the counteroffensive that is now basically in the fifth week. So this is the Zaporozhye um, area, and the second map is basically the Zaporozhye area meets the Donetsk area. But the Russians still control uh, the area of Novodonetskoye. They control the area just south of Makarovka. I'm talking about the Velika Novoselka area. This is on the, let's say, the most easternly side of the fighting. And just wondering if I could show you. No. Anyhow, so that's basically, that gives you an idea of how much territory has been ceded. The Ukrainians still have not managed to reach the first line of defense. Some areas, as we've said, have 4 or 5 lines of defense. So this is still, relatively speaking, in the gray zone. And there have been, interestingly, I had no idea about this guy, but apparently there's this Austrian fella. I don't know if he's like, I'm told that he's actually, a a a sergeant of some kind. I mean, sorry, a military officer of some kind. Um, he's basically saying that the offense, the Ukrainian offense, is over now.
Yes, that was
Last,
Colonel Marcus Reisner
yes, Marcus.
from the Austrian military. And
Yes, thank you.
just keep in mind that Austria, despite what a lot of people might not know, and I think a lot of people who watch the show probably know this, not a NATO member, technically a neutral
Yeah,
country. And out of all the European countries to impose a response on Russia, Austria has been pretty lax, all things considered. It's been part of these pacts with Hungary and Serbia when it does come to the energy cooperation. And if you recall, Gunther Fehlinger, probably the greatest hero and greatest defender of NATO living today, he's very disappointed about that. So, just to bring up the obligatory Gunther
Okay,
Fehlinger
I had no
mention.
idea who this guy was.
But yes, who could forget Gunther Fehlinger? Austria will be in NATO one day. Don't forget it, and he'll be proud. And then they can destroy Serbia and all the other disloyal nations of Europe that refuse to join NATO or remain neutral, like Cyprus and Ireland. The guy is such a clown, but I digress.
Yes. So the, that's the fighting in the southern front. Now, there's a bit of news in the area of Zaporizhia. Someone by the name of Sviatoslav Kondrat from Ivano-Frankovsk in Ukraine. This is West Ukraine. He's guys that executed those 12 Russian soldiers who surrendered, and they were executed in that backyard. That became kind of an infamous video. The Russians, pressed charges. So did the Ukrainians, but against the men who were executed. So pathetic. So one of those three guys has been killed, R.I.P. And I always thought that was a bit of good news. Makievka is this town, I think, near the border of Luhansk and Donetsk, in a different theater than where he was killed. So just a bit of news there. And Ugledar, there's been intense fighting all across the front lines. But there haven't been the kind of charges that the Ukrainians were doing in the first 2 weeks since the start of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which began in the wee hours of June the 4th. So Ugledar has nothing there has really changed. Marinka has been more or less static. The Russians lost last week. During the show, I mentioned some territory around Avdiivka. Since then, in a different direction, they've managed to push closer to the southern tip of Avdiivka. But a lot of intense fighting has been going on in Artemovsk or Bakhmut. So much so that as I messaged you, I tend to think like this is interesting because it ties in with Prigozhin, of course, and in a greater sense than him taking Bakhmut, and that is the fortifications that you see that Russia has implemented all across the south. Those fortifications go all the way north as well, definitely to the border of Lugansk and Donetsk, where they meet. And the fortifications that were drawn there, they don't even go to Bakhmut. So the interesting thing is Prigozhin basically somehow convinced the Russian MOD to go for Bakhmut. And in a way, you could see how the Russians don't have a lot of ambition to take uh, a lot of cities, to make any big aero moves. The way my brother explained it is Gerasimov's theory is that the days of big aero moves are over, unless you're fighting like a substantially weak opponent. But in a modern theater, like now, particularly one that has drones and spy satellites and spy planes 24/7, Ukraine has like no less than 50 of these planes flying on its behalf. Um, then that is impossible. Um, so um, I guess the Russians have seen that that it would be better for the Ukrainians to smash against them then go forward. But there's no there's no doubt that the taking of Bakhmut, I think, sparked something in Russians, and it's what made Wagner and Prigozhin so liked. Um, Taking territory, even at cost, uh, won the respect and admiration of a lot of Russians. And fighting around there has been very, very intense, particularly around the southern crumple zone of that includes the town or village. It's like one street, Klishevka. Now, Klishevka is important because, Wagner only captured Klishevka back in January. And the area immediately north of Klishevka is extremely well fortified. It doesn't mean it can't be taken. Obviously, it was already taken once, but it's a very difficult area to attack. And to the west of that is a canal. The Russians have been pushed out of that canal. And it looked like Klishevka was going to fall. And just last night, as I messaged you this stuff, like, basically I said, if if they give up Bakhmut, like you can talk all you want about, how the West will cynically make a lot of hay out of this. But the fact of the matter is, it will demoralize the Russian public and the soldiers. Uh, Solidar and Bakhmut falling was a major achievement. And in the northern section and Berezhovka, um, the Russians also managed to push back the Ukrainians as well. So we'll see, like, what will happen. Now, I have seen extensive footage. I've been following this for at least 3 weeks. I was surprised at the intensity. While the intensity in Zaporizhia has decreased, it has remained extremely steady around Bakhmut. Indeed, back in the first week of June, just as the offensive has started, even prior to the offensive starting, I saw a headline in the Washington Post about like new recruits that were determined to take back Bakhmut. And I laughed at that. I think I even mentioned it on one of the shows. And um, so,
I mean, you were
go ahead.
laughing at it was frankly a bit of an underreaction because if you recall, during the height for the Battle of Bakhmut, as Russia was breaking through, as the Ukrainians were faltering there, it was considered the worst place to be deployed as a Ukrainian. I believe the life expectancy for a freshly minted Ukrainian soldier going into Bakhmut was about 4 hours. And this was around the time when they were just cranking out conscripts after about 3 to 5 days of any real training after they got them cleared through all the bureaucratic red tape. And there were several recordings that went around. Now, once again, you can say audio is manipulated, whatever, but pretty straightforward. You can find them; they're all over the place. A lot of good. I will recommend a source. A lot of good information, especially about on-the-ground videos out of Ukraine that just come down to daily life, whether that be from civilian to soldier, whatever. Lord Bebo on both Telegram and Twitter does all kinds of archiving of this stuff. I couldn't recommend that enough if you want a glimpse of really just stuff that's on the ground, stuff that is happening day to day. But clip after clip of these guys speaking Russian, not Ukrainian, you'll notice, talking about how they don't want to go to Bakhmut, that they would sooner defect than go to Bakhmut, that they want to be sent anywhere else than Bakhmut. And that was probably, I don't know, about 2 months ago, back when fighting was really intense there. And at that point, I can't imagine. Looking at it from the flip side, so with the Russians, it is a great morale victory, something that was paid for with a lot of blood, but ultimately a triumph. I can only imagine on the Ukrainian side, from the Ukrainian perspective, sure, there is that idea of avenging themselves, taking it back, the idea of pushing back the Russians, but I can only imagine even more than that is the reputation of just Bakhmut being a complete death trap that they don't even want to try to retake, that they don't even want to go into because of how brutal it was the first time. And of course, it flip flops. The value of Bakhmut flip flops depending on who was winning. It was just a pissing contest to the Russians. It was the crux of the Ukrainian defensive line when the Ukrainians had the upper hand in it. So it's one of those things that goes back and forth. And really, I mean, look, we all know that Ukrainian generals, by and large, are not waging this war. It's Ukrainian soldiers taking orders from NATO officers. Even with the brazenness of a lot of these NATO officers, when it comes down to sheer pragmatism, I don't see them charging into Bakhmut once again over a pissing contest, and that given the situation on the front lines right now, given the state of the war, just shy of a year and a half in, they're not going to throw away men and resources at something so petty at this point, and that they're probably going to try to do something a bit more unconventional, such as an offensive in the south, as we've seen them at least attempt to do in these past few weeks, especially towards Kherson and Zaporizhia. And of course, there's a lot of talk about the power plant. Will the power plant be hit? Will there be a false flag? Whatever else. But re engaging on that front in particular, I'm not saying it's impossible. There could be an officer, there could be a contingent of NATO and Ukrainian officers petty enough to want to try to retake Bakhmut and Solidar and these much more symbolic targets. But ultimately, and look, maybe I'm giving them too much credit, I think pragmatism is starting to win the day as the situation becomes much more dire for Ukraine and NATO.
Yeah, I mean, Zelensky made a statement that we'll see something happen Sunday, right? So that's 2 days just before the Vilnius summit officially kicks off. I imagine the Monday, the last of NATO member representatives will be flying into and landing in Vilnius. So, um, I mean, it's not that Ukraine isn't going to receive funding because it doesn't do very well. The narrative can be spun in a different way, like we have to help Ukraine because now it's on its back foot, right? They can always spin it, but I think the intention, right, is to make it seem that Ukraine is winning. And that is primarily for the Western and Ukrainian public. That's what retaking Bakhmut would be all about, right? Is
I would
to
agree
win.
with the caveat. I would say
Mm,
what they're trying to concoct right now isn't that necessarily Ukraine is winning, but that Ukraine has a fighting chance of winning right now because they want
yes.
they want to express a certain desperation that does exist, but they also don't want it to seem like a foregone conclusion that the Ukrainians have just been crushed at this point and are being kept on complete life support by NATO. They don't want to give off that impression. They want to give they want to cast an air of pessimism with a glimmer of optimism because
Yeah.
that's optimal for what they're trying to do right now, for the narrative they're trying to paint and for what they're trying to funnel into Ukraine.
Well said. Yeah, I agree with that. Because there have been more articles. We explained the last two shows that more and more articles have been written in the Western press, just flat out saying that Ukraine has lost 20 to 30% of the material that it's been given. There have been enormous costs in the thousands of dead, and many times more in injured in the efforts for Zaporizhia, ignoring really the kind of horrific law. And I've seen them. The fighting is incredibly intense around the crumple zones of Bakhmut. It's to me it appears almost as intense. Um, I saw videos from Avdiivka and Klishevka. Now I know Avdiivka is a different area, but the efforts to take Klishevka, the same kind of images of destroyed BMPs and tanks is just as evident there, as we saw in Zaporozhye you know in the first half of June. Uh, as far as the rest of the minutia minute goes, further north towards Seversk, the Russians have managed to make small gains around Seversk. Whoever whoever the Ukrainian commander is around Seversk, you have to acknowledge that he's done a good job. This is coming on the heels of the Ukrainians losing more and more officers. More and more of their officer staff has been reduced, or lower um, soldiers have been promoted, but they don't, they haven't gone to officer school. But that's the situation that Ukraine is in. And yet there have been more articles now that the CIA is actively conducting this war. Um, Further north, the Russians continue to advance west of Kremenaya, and they're holding their ground just outside of Kupiansk. There were no less than 10 UAVs that were shot down in Belgorod. Some Ukrainian affiliated forces, these are probably the so-called Russian freedom fighters, were sent back. I saw footage of a small unit of roughly 4 or 5 men that tried to cross over but were shelled, and then they retreated. And then, of course, since the last show, 2 command centers have been taken out. The first command center that was taken out by the Russians was in Sumy. And today, another command center, and the Russian MOD is saying not only was this command center in Lvov taken out, but so were Western material. So they mentioned that they think they took out Challenger tanks as well. Not that Britain had many to offer, but that is one of the claims. In the Bryansk area, back to like the Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Azov Sea area, 2 Storm Shadow missiles were intercepted by the Russians. Um, Both of them were quite intact. So the Russians have really upped their game in electronic warfare. They're managing. We've said on the show for a few months now that they've managed to like force HIMAR missiles to go in different directions. They're managing even Stinger missiles that are aimed at their helicopters, which have performed extremely well in Zaporizhia, to miss. And so now they're doing it to British Storm Shadow missiles. Now, the Americans have approved for the use of cluster munitions, which I think they're illegal, but nonetheless, they have approved of them. And you're beginning to see a kind of narrative developing. The Russians probably didn't go after command centers as a kind of agreement, and now certain lines have been crossed. For instance, a HIMAR missile was used that attacked a hospital where children were located in the Donetsk Republic. So I think we've seen these hits on command centers going on at least since April. But it was in June that Putin began to formally state that that is what they were going to do. So in a war, both sides want like an escalatory ladder that they can use as threats to apply pressure. Um, it's just part of warfare. You want to create this escalatory, retaliatory um, system, if you will.
Yes, you don't want to expend
Um,
everything you have all at once because when you get to a position where negotiations might be
yeah.
a possibility, you don't want to have expended all of your bargaining power. Which, I mean, look at the demands they make of Russia whenever the Russians propose negotiations. You have to give up everything you've gained in this war. You have to concede to all of our demands, and then we can negotiate, which is more or less an
Mhm.
unconditional surrender by definition. But I'm glad you brought up the cluster munitions and the escalatory rhetoric because I do have quite a few thoughts on that. Now, keeping in mind what I just said, I would say that since February 24th, 2022, since the declaration of the so called special military operation, which I'll get into some opinions on the terminology there and some things I've been thinking about that lately versus calling it an outright war, but I'll get to that in a moment. The Russians have been exceptionally conciliatory. And I think if we're to believe the terms of the April 2022 agreement, believe that pen to paper, let's just say, I don't know, 75% of it was honest, true, and accurate, if not the whole thing. 75% enough, just for the sake of argument. It shows that the Russians were willing to concede a lot in order to have a swift end of this conflict and more or less a return to the pre 2014 status quo. Now, think of what you will about that. Think maybe that was a proper response or that was inadequate and was just turning back the clock for the inevitable to happen again. But point being is Russia was exceptionally conciliatory. It took until about, let's see, 8 months into the war for Russia to begin major infrastructure strikes, and that was after the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the summer and fall of 2022 and the
Mm.
strikes on targets in Russia proper. Particularly the Kerch Bridge is what initiated that response. When the Ukrainians tried to bomb Kerch Bridge, the Russians returned in kind with strikes on infrastructure. Then it goes on. Then you do see the striking of command centers in the beginning of 2023. But ultimately, that is a topic that isn't broached. Because we all know that these command centers are run by NATO staff. Sure, there's Ukrainians in there, there's even Ukrainian officers in there, but the people making the real calls in this war are NATO generals. Because it's the only reasons the Ukrainians have been able to sustain this war effort. Between the equipment and the leadership of NATO forces, that's the only reason how. Because if this were left up to Ukrainian officers, especially experienced Ukrainian officers, they're employing the same Soviet tactics that their Russian counterparts learned in the same military academies all those decades ago. Once again, these men, in many cases, were under the same banner, in the same military, just 4 decades ago. Soviet Union was not that far in the rearview mirror. I think a lot of people forget that.
Mhm.
But with that being said, the Russians being conciliatory towards the Ukrainians and the West, because of course they know who really calls the shots around here, particularly Washington, they did not want to start wasting NATO officials. They did not want to bring in that sort of escalation. But that has gradually changed. You see more strikes on this. You saw the strikes in Sumy at the beginning of the week. And you also saw the strikes on Lvov last night. Last night as of recording. We're recording July 6, 2023 right now, so those strikes were on July 5th. Massive strikes on Lvov. The Ukrainians claim 3 out of 10 Kinjal missiles landed. The Russians claim, of course, all of them landed. So,
All of them.
yeah, probably
Yeah.
looking towards either 5 or more if we are being honest and objective about the situation. The Ukrainians are probably going to downplay it for obvious reasons. But the Russians have far less apprehensions about launching strikes on command centers now, command centers that are almost certainly filled with NATO personnel. This is also on top of, now, Medvedev said it, so you have to take it with a massive grain of salt because he is the provocateur. He's filling the Zhirinovsky-sized hole left in Russian politics. Talking about there's only two ways a war ends, either negotiations or we drop nukes like the Americans did in 1945. Now, of course, a lot of that was just inflammatory rhetoric. A lot of that was part of this broader PR war that's been going on simultaneously with the actual on-the-ground war. It's just something that always happens, especially in the age of telecommunications being so advanced that we're currently in. But you've also seen the Russians make more substantial threats regarding the supplying of F 16, Storm Shadows, and other more quote unquote advanced NATO weapons, particularly referring to Romania and Poland and their role in supplying it, talking about the culpability they have in this conflict and the potential of them being dragged into it. But once again, they've also been saying that since the beginning of the war, but it has been more consistent and more harsh rhetoric. So we are seeing, both in action and in words, the Russians are returning a lot of the Western stubbornness in kind, that if the West is not going to concede, if they're not going to come to the bargaining table, that the Russians are going to adopt equally, if not more, aggressive language. Now, some people argue they should have done this since the beginning of the war. Some people argue that they should have leveraged their position as a nuclear power and just a military power in general since the beginning of this war. Perhaps they should have, considering the fact that they almost had a peace deal 2.5 months into the war.
Yeah.
I could see the apprehension to do that because even if it isn't the greatest deal, even if they didn't get everything they wanted, it was still laying the groundwork for their future goals and also, once again, buying them more time. And if I had to summarize the 2022 agreement, it was just the Minsk agreement 2.0 on slightly more favorable terms to the Russians. But it was still rather favorable to the Ukrainians considering what kind of deal the Ukrainians can look at now if they were to start negotiating tomorrow. Now, getting into the question of Russian escalation and how they've conducted the war effort, as I brought up a few minutes ago, the designation of a special military operation versus an outright war. I believe that one reason, and I don't think this is uncommon or unique belief for myself, but one reason that popular support for the war has been so stable and so high is because it has had relatively little impact on public life. So far, war spending has only been about 3% of the GDP. You haven't had any mass conscription.
Yes.
You've only had the mobilization of reservists and those with military experience. And I think with the two waves of mobilization, we're only looking at about 450,000 men. In insofar as the amount of men who are both in combat roles and are actually seeing action in the front lines, it's probably far less than 450,000 because you had the initial 300,000, you had another push for another 150,000, and now the Kremlin has been kicking the can down the road, toying with the idea of another 180,000 mobilized from the reserves and from former service members who also, once again, it's a bit of a gray area who falls into the reserves or not. But that's, once again, getting into military structural autism that isn't particularly relevant to this point. But if they were to adopt the legal designation of war, ignoring the reaction of the outside world and the international organizations, the UN's, whatever, ignoring quote unquote international law, from the Russian perspective, from the Russian civilian and internal perspective, that implies far higher military spending, far more drastic conscription mobilization campaigns, and also just a complete overhaul of civilian life focused towards the war effort. Now, perhaps the Russians would tolerate more than they would now, but I don't think the Russians at this point, especially given what the conflict is, are going to tolerate a full war economy over the size and the scope of the conflict that they're looking at right now. That, and I think that's also been a large part of the reason that the designation of war has been avoided, because even if they weren't to fully mobilize the nation's men and economy, it still does create those rumors, still does create those whispers. I know the number gets played up, but look at how many men left Russia upon the outbreak, the declaration, the SMO, and the mobilization waves. It wasn't a huge number, but it was a noticeable number, and they went to mostly neighboring nations. Funny enough, the European Union did deny them entry, which I I love the logic that not even Russian dissidents are acceptable anymore. Not even people who are against Putin's regime are acceptable anymore. That if you're Russian, you're just completely condemned as far as the European Union, NATO, and the West is concerned. It's I, there's something just so funny about that and so self-defeating
Mm.
for the Russian liberal ideology, in my opinion. But that's also
Yeah.
aside the point. But you have that, and you have the increase in operations. But it does make you wonder if this was pushed at the beginning of the war, brings up the question again, would it have made a difference? And I think the other bigger question that we also have to look at, especially on the eve of the Vilna summit, which will be taking place less than a week from now, is at this point, I think a lot of people in Russia across the border are starting to realize it, whether that be the politicians, whether that be the military class, even the civilian class, realize that if this war is not brought to a conclusion favorable to Russia soon, it escalation with the West, with NATO, is inevitable. It might not be everything at first. It might just be the Poles at first, or the Romanians, or whatever wall or meat shield of Eastern and Central European countries they want to send into this at first. But even once they have that foot in the door, it's an escalation. And as the CIA itself admitted, they have active operations in Ukraine right now. So we do have Americans on the ground. I mean, we've had Americans on the ground since before the war in several capacities, both official and unofficial. So that number only continues to increase as the war goes on. That number has not decreased. Of course, you have the Ukrainians shutting down their international brigades towards the beginning of the war, but that hasn't stopped the influx of foreign volunteers, especially from places like Poland, Georgia, various Western nations, and that number will only continue to increase as this war goes on. You'll only get more Westerners, and as more Westerners and more NATO line forces come in, and as the war escalates on the ground, as body bags start to come home more and more, that's going to have one or two effects. That's either going to turn the stomachs of a lot of Westerners, or since it's in an unofficial capacity, you're going to see, in my opinion, the people in the West are going to be propagandized, as so many people are easily propagandized across the world, that look at what the Russians have done to your people. Look at what the Russians have done to our troops who were in Ukraine despite us not being technically at war with Russia. Are we going to tolerate the Russians waging this campaign of terror against our military? Whatever. That's going to be a popular sell with a lot of people on both sides of the Atlantic, unfortunately. A lot of people will take that hook, line, and sinker. In which case, it's getting to a crucial point, and I'm not trying to sensationalize. I'm not trying to play this up for the show or anything. I sincerely believe, and I'm not going to put an exact time frame on it, that in the near future, let's just say the next 3 to 6 months, if there is not a satisfactory conclusion of the conflict in Russia's favor, this is inevitably going to escalate into something beyond any of our imaginations. And I don't want to see that. I'm sure you don't want to see that. Even the most hawkish of people, they might say otherwise in their rhetoric, but deep down inside, when it comes to their gut instinct, I doubt even they want to see it. Now, they'll do all sorts of mental gymnastics. They'll come up with all sort of self justifications in order to think why this is the right move. But truthfully, when we are looking at such a large scale conflict in Ukraine, even if it is just a quote unquote coalition of the willing, even if it is just funneling in Eastern and Central European countries to bolster the Ukrainian losses and to bring in fresh troops, not even involving Western Europe or North Americans at that point, it is going to get to a dangerous position. And especially once you get NATO troops in there in a let's just even say a semi official capacity, because you're going to get this weasel game that they play with Article 5 where we can go in, we can conduct operations in Ukraine, we can strike at Russian targets even inside of Russia, but if Russia is to respond in kind, if they hit targets in Poland, if they hit targets in Romania, even they hit some designated targets in Ukraine, that triggers Article 5, that triggers a crisis, and that brings up the question for intervention. So it is an extremely dangerous game that is being played right now, and the longer this war continues, without a satisfactory conclusion for the Russian side, the likelihood of this becomes almost an inevitability, at least in my estimation.
Yeah, I mean, the whole thing, and I think this ties into what you're saying, right? Like, I think the whole Zaporizhia nuclear power plant threat, right? In Ukraine, they've already made commercials about like what to do. You know, apparently one video shows like a guy driving with a COVID mask, and like he stops the car and he kneels down like inside the car. It's just crazy,
Ugh.
right? But part of it is just to keep the tension going. Part of it is to say, this war ain't over by a long shot. But it's a half measure to say that they blame that the Russians would do this. Like, there's no reason for the Russians to do this. The Western public, like a lot of the Western public, fundamentally believes this, right? Like, I was on a little vacation seeing a friend out west, and we stayed at a bed and breakfast, and the wife was uh, like Scandinavian Canadian background, but these are Scandinavians who've been living in Canada for a very long time, just like in Minnesota, right? And he was an American um, outside of the Seattle area, but both of them were Christians, and prayer before breakfast and so on. And like this dude was convinced that the Russians blew up the Zaporizhia, the Nord Stream pipelines. Like why would he think that? Well, obviously he thinks that because America is great, right? America's super. Russia's evil, right? And no matter how dysfunctional and anti-Christian his own civilization gets, and no matter how much America promulgates this stuff, right? Because like if America's like suddenly, I don't know, collapses or for whatever reason, let's say hypothetically, so this this shit is going to decrease dramatically, right?
I
That's
mean,
where it
it'll have
originates
its
from.
holdouts, but in terms of where the
Oh,
funding comes from,
they're
where's the muscle
no,
for it comes from? It's yeah, it's it.
it's there won't even be any holdouts. The holdouts will be for like a week because I mean this whole war has demonstrated one thing, and that is that America has formalized its control over its vassals. It could not openly do it before. It does so now because there's a war, and the so-called the moment of American leadership has arisen. That's just the euphemism for America formalizing its control. Remember that peacetime proves nothing. War reveals who the sovereign is. Oh, never forget that.
I'm glad you brought
Peacetime is
this
an
up
illusion.
because there's some economic data I want to get into from Europe as soon as you're finished with this because I think
Yeah,
it just solidifies your point. So I did see
right.
this on.
But
Yeah, go ahead.
let me
Go
just
ahead.
finish. So I said to him, why would they do that? I go, they're already turned off the gas 2 weeks before the explosion. There's no reason for them to do that. Oh, so you believe? I said, yeah, I do. I mean, they said they would end it. They would stop it one way or another. Like, why wouldn't they do that? Right? And then, the conversation changed, and my friend and I were ready to go out, and he started talking about the American dollar, not to bet against the American dollar. I'm going like, this guy is so typically American. It boggles my mind, right? Like, dude, like all the stereotypes of like a highly business centric American Christian and highly patriotic, like all those tropes are like just like live in this guy. Now his wife was far more skeptical. She actually did not believe the Russians did it and believed it was probably the Americans, right? And you could tell that this kind of bothered him, because like I don't know, because you're somehow obligated to believe in America. This is so ridiculous. So um, one of the things that academic agent brought up like months and months ago was he said, if you look at the Americans and you compare how they um, react to their own elites, yes, they complain about them, whatever, whatever. But when there's a conflict, right? When there's a conflict, Americans side with their own elites in a better way than other countries do. Um, if you corner them, they'll just like Richard Spencer, for instance, had a tweet this week where he says, NATO is invitation only.
I know
And
it was he said the American Empire is invitation.
it's invitation only. Yeah, yeah. He actually believes that, right? Um,
Remember when this
and
guy
then he
was in the
said,
Dugan
and how did he?
and like
But how did he finish it? Yeah. But how did he finish it? He says the same thing that H.P. Lovecraft, that that what's his name? That goof.
Do you even need to name it? Look, I it
Paul
just all
Fahrenheit.
of them. Just
All of them, right? So what did they all say? Well, you can't push us out even if you wanted to. Like we're too big. So academic agent had this tweet where he basically said if you press them hard enough, all of them will come to the same point and say, yeah, but we took over, so what are you going to do to us? You can't push us out, right? That's the bottom line, right? And that's their thinking on it. That I like you like it's you you can see it in the Twitter universe, but you can also see it in real life, is what I'm
well,
saying.
look,
And they're geared up for this war.
I just have to give a caveat that now promise that you won't uh, find my address after the show because no, you might have my address, but I'm going to tentatively say this with a major caveat. I agree with them, but it's much like cancer where you can't dislodge it. So yeah, I think they're right. I just think it's a bad thing. Like, yeah,
Oh
it's
yeah, but what I'm saying is
yeah.
they ultimately think it's a good thing.
Oh yeah, I agree with that part, and I know exactly what you're getting at. But like I
Like they'll
said,
tell
it's
you, here are the ills of my empire, right? And you say, well, I would like your ill empire to leave my country. Oh no, no, we're not going to do that.
yeah,
Th-
it's self-destruction. Self-destruction turned outward. Look, if we have to suffer, the rest of the world does too. It's
Yes, and this is what I mean. Like they're Americans are more aligned with their elites than other countries are.
absolutely. I would agree with that. I don't know what it is in the American psyche where they will glom onto this, where a lot of them, even no matter how skeptical they say they are in polls, no matter how distrustful they've grown of the government, during times of crisis, and I think we've seen this time and time again, especially in recent history, and I think COVID's probably the most recent example, people will ultimately default back to authority because whether consciously or unconsciously, what I think happens is they still believe in all the mantras about government of the people, democracy, etc., 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 where they truly believe that they're made up of popularly chosen, competent, meritocratic individuals. Where I'm not even saying that people consciously believe in this. I think subconsciously it's just been so ingrained in them that they really can't break free of that. But ultimately, they will snap in line as soon as the crisis comes down because I think it's just in the Anglophone, but particularly American psyche. Because look, I think this problem exists all across the West. I think it is more pronounced in the Anglosphere. You see it in Canada, you see it in the UK, you see it in Australia. But I think it's of a particular form in the US that is just so hard to break people out of. In which case, it because once again, you can talk about let's just compare the U.S. to the U.K. The UK is a long-standing nation that has had a real ethnogenesis that is, once again, it's an old nation. The U.S. is fundamentally a civic nation. Now, I'm not going to deny that, yeah, when it was founded, whatever, you can talk about that all day, that, yeah, they expected predominantly Northwestern Europeans to live and inhabit and rule this country. For right or wrong, I'm not even going to get into that. I think you all know my opinion, but that's aside the point. So, fundamentally, Americans have a very civic minded idea of government, nation, and society, as opposed to maybe even just the residual ethnic idea that exists in the UK, and I would say certainly much more in the rest of Europe, where it's the people, it's the ethnos that makes the nation instead of the civic institutions. Because once you forsake the civic institutions, functionally America doesn't exist anymore. Because while I'm not going to deny outright an American ethnogenesis, it's tied up so much in institutions and uh, pillars of civic society. It's just the way the nation developed.
Yeah, I mean it. I'll give you an example, and I'm glad you mentioned that it's kind of all across the Anglosphere, right? There's this kind of Anglo supremacy. Um, so I was talking, I can't disclose with whom, but I was talking with somebody at work,
It was
my
me.
age, and we were talking about Patton and I said, you know, who cares about Patton? It's good he got killed. Because my rationale was basically, after everything that Europe had gone through, in World War II, he thought like the 3 million plus German soldiers should now be forced to fight the Soviet Union, right? Like after, because, well, why not expend American lives? Oh, no, 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 right? And like I say this, and 5 minutes of talking, and the conversation moves to the fall of the Soviet Union. You know what he says? He says, I always thought, like, after the Soviet Union fell, we should have just rounded up all those Eastern Europeans and forced them to fight Russia. Like, it's the same mentality. Like, he agrees with you that, like, about Patton and his idea and what, like, he looked like he agreed with my negative take, and then he says, "Oh yeah, you know what? This is what we should have done after the Berlin Wall fell down." Right? It's the same idea, and see, that's the thing, right? Because all these little countries that want to join, like, you can never be. You can try all you want to out America by being even more America than America. By, I don't know, accepting, trans rights and gay rights and all that. But you have to understand that they're always the leader, right? Like, they're always going to get the official new iteration of whatever global homo is, not you, right?
Yeah, and
You can only.
honestly, the idea of you being in a pissing contest to try to be more American than them is exactly where they want you. They want you to try to outcompete them because you drive yourself further in that spiral, you drive yourself further down that line of thought. Which is why they love it when the Canadians, particularly the Anglosphere, who like to contrast themselves with the Americans by putting themselves above that, saying we lived your values better than you. Not that this doesn't exist in continental Europe, but once again, it's particularly pronounced in the Anglosphere, probably just because of common language, if we're being honest.
And Nordic countries
Well,
really go out of their
hey,
way.
I mean, gotta consider Nordic countries like what 80% of the population, whatever, knows English. Like, and that's even more than like
Yeah.
the Germans, who I think it's only about 60% of Germans are fluent in English. So, and then yeah, you get to other places in Europe, and it really is a defensive mechanism to have your people not be that literate in English. It's really insulates your nation from so much cultural rot.
Yeah.
I say is doing this program in English, but here we are speaking the language of the empire, the language of globalism. And maybe one day we'll be able to do some non-English broadcasts. That might be fun.
Oh yeah.
That's totally contingent on me. I know you got that down. I'm struggling like fish out of water, but I will spare you the details of me trying to be free of this tongue that I am cursed with. But I'm getting far too sidetracked here. So looking at all of this, I think it really does just encapsulate what we're looking at with the American Empire and the lengths that they were willing to go to completely demolish Europe. And to reference some of that data I brought up earlier, this is from a Twitter thread by an account called Canthan 2030, and just some bullet points he had about
Mm.
Europe's economy from '08 onwards. So the EU collectively had an economy 10% larger than the US in '08 before the financial crisis. US now in 2023 is 50% larger than the EU. So the real estate bubble, the crash of the housing market that caused the global financial crisis, Europe did not see the same level of recovery that the US did. When it comes to technology, the US has outcompeted Europe and also has kneecapped Europe in terms of having native tech industry, which has led to them falling behind in just the crucial industries that have cropped up as a result of this, whether that be startups, AI, quantum computing, whatever else. The number of European companies on Fortune 500 dropped dramatically after '08. The U.S., of course, had the military campaigns all across the Middle East, which led to waves of refugees and migrants settling in Europe, further destabilizing the continent. Of course, in the past year and a half, we've had the war in Ukraine, which Europe has had to bear the economic brunt of when it comes to sanctioning Russia, when it comes to the sanctions, once again, and possibly by design, they were far more punitive towards Europe than Russia or any other Russian aligned nation. And really, it comes down to the fact that the American empire has so many collaborators within European leadership. Now, it goes back far further than that because after 1945, with the reconstruction of Europe, the Marshall Plan, and the fall of the Soviet Union and the integration of the Eastern Bloc into that system, economically and militarily, they had Europe in a stranglehold. But of course, as time went on, you had leaders from European countries, the elites of European countries, themselves, and then sending their kids to American institutions for education. And then, even if they didn't, the American institutions later sent their people to educate the Europeans, to have those Europeans educated out of American institutions take over European institutions, and just became a it became a self-sustaining system in that regard, where the Americans completely overwhelmed European institutional power. In which case, when it comes, I don't need to go over basic reactionary stuff with you because I'm sure once you control the institutional power, it's your world to control, really. And then it eventually gets to the point where the U.S. blows up the Nord Stream pipeline, commits acts of economic terrorism against Europe throughout the course of this war, and nothing is said. And at the end of the day, when this war expands, it's going to be the Europeans who are fighting it before the Americans go in. Now, the Americans will go in if they have to, but they will throw waves upon waves of Eastern Europeans, followed by Western Europeans, into this. And if that still hasn't been resolved at that point, you're going to have the Americans themselves go in. And that is the consequences of this war continuing. If Russia does not get a decisive victory in Ukraine and reassert itself as a serious player. Now, I'm not saying Russia has made a complete fool of itself, but I'm saying Russia has certainly not projected the image of a country that you would not dare to challenge. At this point, it still does look very challengeable, which is why you have this protracted war, which is why you have the loads of aid going into Ukraine, the loads of volunteers going into Ukraine, because Russia has not reasserted itself yet. I'm not saying it's out of the realm of possibility, but I'm just saying that has yet to occur, and frankly, for the sake of Russia and for the sake of just global stability, needs to happen sooner or later. And then, of course, you have the potential China-Taiwan conflict, or a potential conflict in East Asia involving China as a major player, that also needs to be taken into consideration, which is also a large part of the reason that they're going to throw the Europeans at the Russians, because when it comes to confronting China, which is arguably the larger threat to the American empire at the moment, or if not at the moment, will be very soon, you're going to need the full might of American power in order to counter China, because, look, America has declined, America has become debauched, but especially when it comes to naval power, it still is, at least theoretically speaking, a force to be reckoned with. It still is a country that can cause a great deal of damage and can bring a lot of people down with it, as we had previously said. So, just the complete implosion of Europe post '08, and I'm sure that when it came to the economic recovery, when it came to the management of the '08 crisis and onward in Europe, once again, you had the American educated American collaborators in charge in Europe for several decades at that point. And you have to imagine that maybe they didn't make the best effort to revitalize their nations post economic crash. Maybe they didn't make the best effort to reassert their nations. We certainly know after World War II they didn't militarily. And there was points where, even as part of the Marshall Plan, in order to accept aid, that the U.S. would buy off military surplus from these nations, like France and the UK, former allies in this war effort, where they turned the French and the British fleets into shells of themselves after World War II in order for aid from the Marshall Plan. Of course, Germany is probably the most egregious example, being under direct military occupation. You also have Italy and Japan as well, which were to a lesser extent treated the same as Germany, but Germany was certainly the country that we saw the full might of American colonization. And this has been the fate of Europe since 1945. And really think of what you will about the ruling class in Germany in the 1930s and 40s. But when it comes to Europe being a sovereign force, regardless of what you think about ideologically, when it comes to keeping Anglo American, particularly American influence on the continent, that was really the last ditch effort. And I'm not saying that they would have been necessarily successful even in a more favorable scenario for them, but we do have to look at after World War II, after that defeat, it was a foregone conclusion. As we saw, the British hand over the keys to the empire to the Americans, allowed them to assume more and more of their imperial power, set up shop in their former colonies, and of course, the decolonization project, while a large part of that was the Soviet Union is doing, it was also just as much, if not more, the American project, because as you peel away these colonial holdings from the Europeans, it creates an entire new battleground for influence, which is why it was so desirable by the winning powers of World War II, that being the U.S. and the Soviet Union, particularly the U.S., because they could just come in, they could assume the British infrastructure, they could assume the French infrastructure. I mean, why else do you think we were in Vietnam for so long? We were in Vietnam since what, 1959, for until 1973, and I think we still had residual forces there until the 1975 with the official end of the war. So once again, you saw this happen time and time again. But I think I am retreading a lot of old ground here. But I want you to understand the extent of the American occupation and domination of Europe, because it might be easy to think, and this is a trap I fell into right before the war broke out, thinking that, well, the Europeans certainly have enough self interest and self preservation not to go along with something that would be so disastrous, like 11 sanctions packages on Russia. And while that may be true when it comes to the average European, if you were to have governments that were actually representing the interests of their people, the closest example I could probably give you is if every government in Europe was like Hungary, that may have been the case. But the vast majority of European governments, east, west, north, and south, are American collaborators, are people who were educated in American universities or these knockoffs of American universities inside of their own countries or other places in Europe. But you get the point. And ultimately,
Yeah.
the occupation is so far entrenched. And look, I have a very positive opinion of the European continent. I think if they were able to assert themselves as an independent force, they would probably be a very much needed moderating force in the world, especially in combination with the Russians. And hopefully, we could see some sort of reconciliation between the two, which I do believe that we were starting to see in the
Mhm.
2000s, but was very quickly derailed for obvious reasons. But ultimately, I can't fault the Europeans as a whole for not standing up to this, because fundamentally they have no avenues of standing up to this. But I have nothing but scorn and contempt for the European ruling class for, in many ways, their willing cooperation with the American empire and their limperous attempts to try to resist it. Now, perhaps it's unfair to that because they also have no avenues of resistance, but once again, these are people who willingly and enthusiastically go along with every American imperial project at the expense of their own nation and people.
Yes. I don't know what more I can add on to that. The one thing that I was thinking about as you were saying this is that there have been a few articles in the last week or two, and particularly this week, that have emerged about energy security, and but with more implicit meanings about what that could mean. I know we've covered it on the show extensively, and that is like the deindustrialization of Europe as a means of, I mean, you could call it, it basically as a means of not enriching uh, basically your enemies. And if Europe has to be deindustrialized for that to happen, then America will make sure that Europe is deindustrialized. Um, and of course, we've seen over the course of a year and a half that a lot of the even Muslim world has sided with Russia, and it's interesting because there's that famous little video by Zhirinovsky where he burns an American dollar, and he because like 30 years ago he predicted that there would be a war between America and Russia, and that most of the Muslim world would side with Russia, and then he like burns the dollar, and that this war would be about the American dollar. Um, but I do think the tanking of the European economy um, is a way to keep Europe obedient. And I mean, we'll see what happens after Vilnius, right? Now, some people don't take it very seriously, and I don't know whether to take it seriously either. There's talks of a Ukraine NATO council, right? Well, there was a Russia NATO council for many years. Uh, of course, America had no intention to ever allow Russia into NATO, right? Like Russia would have to be balkanized first in order to be in NATO, right? That's the whole point of it. Even though America bemoans constantly about how much money it has to spend on NATO and why its European partners aren't contributing more, don't let that fool you. America is always going to be the primary stake and shareholder in NATO, right? It would never want any of these countries to be remotely on par with America.
Oh, Washington is fully
It,
willing to bear the expense of a crippled Europe if it means denying them any sort of strategic autonomy or cooperation with the
yes,
rest of the world. They're willing to completely keep. They're willing to keep Europe as an invalid dependent if it means keeping down any potential rivals or any potential competition.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I guess I don't know what other subjects you wanted to touch upon, but in a way they kind of dovetail with some of Macron's rhetoric and what's been going on in France, because Macron has had a number of things. I guess the funny thing about Macron is he's another one of those unstable guys that attracts the attention of Richard Spencer, because the first guy he was really that he was really attracted to and promulgated was of course Trump, right? And in many ways, Macron is also this kind of a guy, because I mean, if you want to think of the protests as something that could have had not the initiative of, like, let's say NATO or America or the EU, but maybe it had some support. Like, again, this is a very foggy area, because one of the things we didn't see after the shooting of this 17-year-old boy is we didn't see these posters that immediately appeared out of nowhere. And I know there was a vigil, I get it, but it wasn't like Charlie Hebdo. It wasn't like the various terrorist attacks that happened in 2016, both in the UK and in France, or the Manchester concert, and so on. Like, we don't, the posters are ready, like in less than 12 hours. Um, they're very professional looking, and we've discussed this, right? Because um, the British media, in anticipation for the Olympics and after the riots in 2011, uh, actually began working on this method of seizing the narrative right away, right? And we didn't really see that in France. And that could mean one thing or the other. Like, again, I don't pretend to know what happened, but there's lots of footage of arms apparently that were supposed to go to Kiev that ended up in France. Now, it's not that hard to get them, because the criminal underworld in France is a very real thing. And a lot of this looting was a kind of a bravado show of force, where one gang out loots the other. right? Like that's going on, right? Besides, like, I don't know, other opportunists that don't belong in gangs or just thrill seekers. But to get back to Macron, right? He made that statement back in 2019 that NATO is brain dead, that Europe should forge a path that's more independent. He asked a week or two ago that he would like to attend the BRICS meeting. He was denied. He wants, like, the best of both worlds, and he always has. Now, anytime that he has been reprimanded and has had to be forced to toe the line, he does, but that doesn't necessarily negate some of the fruits of his rhetoric and his actions, which fixed a good trade deal with the Chinese. Certainly, Schultz, Ursula von der Leyen did not get that kind of reception. Baerbock, none of these others got that kind of reception in China. Borrell was scheduled to meet in China. China just flat out denied his invitation. Like, they canceled the invitation, so Borrell will not be visiting. I guess what I'm trying to say is he's a loose cannon. He says stuff and it's unacceptable, right? But he won the election, and in a way that he feels, I think he has carte blanche to say what he wants. And I don't think these protests are going to dislodge him, ironically speaking. But on the other hand, like, he's a globalist, but obviously he belongs to some different camp of globalism, or he has a kind of strategy where he can get the best of both worlds. But that's very much like Trump not following the American doctrine. And for this, even though he is often reprimanded successfully, I don't think the Americans can stand this kind of rhetoric coming from him. That's just my take. Does that support, like, involvement? It could. In these riots, have been like, I mean, I saw a car blow up that was driving. Now, I don't know if it was a car bomb inside the car, or but that was nuts. The largest library in France was set on fire with manuscripts that are like hundreds and hundreds of years old. Some people are saying it's worse than the riots in 2005.
And mind you, in
Certainly,
the midst of all this, I would like to remind you that the UN and other brave international organizations decide that many of the priceless treasures, if we're being honest, that came out of the Lavra in Kiev would be safer in France.
oh, oh my God. Oh, what a joke.
So that's what we can look forward to um, in the future, in the near future. So they will.
I mean, I don't want to. Sorry to cut you
No, go
off.
ahead.
I don't want to undermine, like, the obvious problems that France has, anyways, that have been long brewing. Uh, you know what I mean? I don't want to be conspiracy theorist about this, but I think it's also naive to believe that uh, certain international players don't have a hand in these things, right? Um, Anyways, I thought I'd mention that. By the way, the guys over at World War Now did have a great podcast that they just released a few days ago. You can find it on YouTube or on Substack. And also, Semiagog had like a 2-hour video on his take with Prigozhin that was very good. But I'll stop right there.
Certainly, and just to touch back on the point you were making about that about international involvement, I think it's sort of a foregone conclusion that it's involved there. I mean, look at the reason why there are those ethnic blocks in France in the first place. We've discussed this at great length
Mhm.
many times in the past. That they exist for this reason. And Macron, while ultimately he's not that much of a renegade, he's too much of a renegade for comfort, especially when NATO is supposedly more united than ever. They need somebody who's going to fall right in line, and that the certain brand of rebelliousness, despite the fact that he'll kiss the ring at the end of the day, but him spreading that rebellious rhetoric is still unacceptable in a climate like this. Now, in 2019, before the outbreak of full-scale war in Ukraine, it could be tolerated. It could be brushed
Yes.
away. It could be chided. He could get a slap on the wrist. We could call it a day. But when you have things like this, it's just really no room for negotiations. They can't have one of the preeminent NATO members trying to get an invitation to the BRICS summit. You can't have a preeminent NATO member who has frequent contact with Putin and semi-frequent contact with Xi Jinping and the Chinese and other quote-unquote hostile nations. It's not something they can tolerate. Now, what they hope to accomplish from this, if they are, there's not. I mean, we're not due for another French election until what 2027. Not that I think they're trying to remove him from office, just put pressure on him. But in terms of the opposition, in terms of who's in power in France, there's not exactly a rabidly pro-American party that you might expect out of, say, Germany or some other parts of Europe, especially Eastern Europe. But there certainly are more preferable options. Macron is also certainly a more preferable option than somebody like Le Pen, or even as much as I think he was a bit of a joke candidate, Zemmour. Even
Mm.
even Macron is
Yeah.
preferable to those two, so he will be allowed some leeway. But ultimately, when it comes time to toe the line, he'll fall in line and he'll be reprimanded as needed. But ultimately, we're retraining the topic of France being a renegade in NATO, but I think you all get the point, and I think that Macron will also continue to be used strategically in order to find an off ramp if need be, if negotiations really do initiate. And I believe they say autumn is when it's supposed to. I mean, Lukashenko was alluding to that, and I don't have much reason to doubt Lukashenko, despite the fact that, once again, I mean, I know he says a lot of things, but something like this doesn't really seem like that controversial of a take, something that would ruffle that many feathers. But ultimately, that's all I had for Europe and for Vilnius.
Mm.
Until the summit actually happens, then we'll have a clear picture of that. But I do have some Middle Eastern news because there's been a bit happening in the Middle East, particularly in Lebanon, where and in the West Bank as well, where you've had
Yeah.
significant increase in Israeli military activity. So starting with Lebanon, you have 15 shells that were fired at Kfar Shuba in Lebanon by the Israeli army, and this is in southern Lebanon, and this is according to Lebanese news outlet Al Mayadeen, and they say this is the place where, of course, rocket attacks come from Hezbollah, and that, of course, it is a security measure. But we do have Israeli strikes in South Lebanon. We've had the standoff in Jenin in the Palestinian territories. I believe Jenin is in Gaza, where you've actually had, I believe it was 7 out of 9 Israeli helicopters sent in have been downed by Palestinian forces
Hmm.
in Jenin, and so you've had strikes on these Palestinian towns as retaliation for that. But you are seeing the IDF, Israeli military capabilities, faltering, and of course, the more they falter, the more aggressive it becomes. And this is all in the backdrop of reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and the readmittance of Syria into the Arab League, and really the simultaneous implosion of Israeli foreign policy goals. You even have Egypt opening up aid channels to Gaza again, which you recall in some of the recent conflicts, I think 2014, 2018 really stick out, where the Egyptians waffled on opening aid channels to Gaza. And again, we're not talking military aid, we're talking civil aid, and we're talking just relief for the civilian populations. But still, even that, once again, is taking a stand against the Israeli positions there. But you even have Egypt once again faltering on deals that it has made with Israel over what the past, I think, 40 years at this point since the 1979 peace agreement. So the the walls are closing in on Israel. There's not really many options for them. They tried a few months ago to drum up strikes on Iran as another possibility, perhaps a joint U.S. Iranian operation. That was ruled out. I can only speculate now, of course. Neither would actually admit this, neither the U.S. or Israel would admit this, but they think Iranian air defenses are too capable in order for the kind of strike, say, that they would have launched 10, 15 years ago. That is out of the question. It's too high of a risk, too much of an embarrassment is on the line if an operation like that were to fail. So, any real projection of Israeli strength has to come in the immediate vicinity of its neighbors. You'll notice actually activity when it comes to what Israel's been doing in Syria has significantly calmed down. Now there has been more standoffs between the remnant Turkish and Turkish-backed forces and the Syrian government. That situation is still hostile, but you also have the Americans being consistently rooted out of their occupied territories in northeastern Syria. It's become once again yet another black mark for them when it comes to any skirmishes or engagements they get in. The Americans are rooted. They're not putting up much of a fight against the Syrian and Syrian allied forces. So we do have that happening. We have Israel continuing to floundering. They know they're becoming a much more secondary priority of America at this point, especially with somebody like Biden in the White House. When you have a conflict like Ukraine there and a potential conflict between China and Taiwan, the security interest of Israel and the Likud party lobby isn't going to have the same pull it does, I'd say, even, what, 2, 3 years ago, even when with Biden in office, about 2 years ago, where they're just not the priority anymore. There's too many other concerns. And you'll notice that they've been taking a very nuanced stance on the Russian Ukraine war, that they have not provided the Ukrainians with massive arms shipments like one maybe would have expected. That they are walking this tightrope because they don't want to bring down the ire of the Russians, who, once again, are pretty well entrenched in the Middle East. Not that I think Russia would launch strikes on Israel or anything, but it's a very delicate relationship, and I would argue that's actually a reason Netanyahu was able to come back to power, because he was able to balance West and Russian relationships and even Chinese relations to a certain degree. But I mean, you even have China making pacts with the Palestinian Authority and giving more recognition to it and signing more agreements with it. So, once again, the position of Israel is a dire one. They're going to do everything they can to secure their position while they're able to act as brazenly as they are. But we're getting to the point where Israeli brazenness is going to be returned in kind by its neighbors and by its rivals, because there isn't the invincible shield of the American empire to come in and either drop bombs or bring in sanctions against whoever else for threatening Israel, to the point where Israel is either going to have to adapt to a much less favorable position in the region, or they're going to drive themselves into a complete state of destruction. And there's really no other options like that. I can't see exactly a great Zionist revival both in Israel itself and for Israel's main benefactors, especially in the U.S. And I think a lot of it also comes down to the fact that a lot of American Jews, especially younger American Jews, do not have that same attachment to Israel that their parents and their grandparents did. And that, frankly, when it comes to, uh, I guess what could broadly be called Jewish interests, they view modern 21st century America as far more amicable to that than they do the state of Israel.
Yeah, before I give my 2 cents on Israel, I just wanted to mention that um, a month ago yesterday is when Stoltenberg wanted to create a liaison NATO office in Japan, and it was Macron who stood against that, and he's not changed his mind about it. Um, but to get to all the fighting that's happening, it's particularly in Jenin, and then the wider implications. All of June, there have been intense fighting and skirmishes in Israel, in Jenin. You mentioned Egypt. There was an Egyptian, um, I believe he was a border guard, and he killed 3 Israeli border guards before he himself was killed by Israeli defense forces. I've been watching videos the last 2 weeks, in from the West Bank and other areas where heavy skirmishing has been taking place between various Palestinian groups and Israeli forces. I've seen, like in the last 2 weeks, no less than 9 armored cars get blown up, like either very severely damaged or just in shreds. Reminiscent of the kind of IEDs that you saw in the war in Iraq, maybe not blown up in the way that you see BMPs get destroyed in Ukraine, um, but more than like they're more dramatic than anything I've ever seen before. And these are these are heavy armored cars. They are, I would say, far more armored than a Max Pro. Oh, sorry, than a Humvee. They are nothing like a Humvee. But they might not be like the Max Pro international vehicle that the Americans use. Its configuration is slightly different, but it's an armored vehicle nonetheless. And you brought up helicopters, and 2 weeks ago, I saw footage of an Israeli helicopter that had been shot at, and it was forced to land, and then the pilots got out, and the helicopter went in flames. You could say that you know Iran getting nuclear missiles is kind of a euphemism for Iran's influence in the region. It's not that Iran is going to launch these missiles. It's kind of what you've been hinting at and what you've said about Israel, and that is, as greater like Muslim and Arab cooperation increases, you'll have more bold acts take place in and around Israel that will upset the balance of power against Israel. And really, like, just to bring it back to Russia for a moment, um, the Israelis are fully aware that, through the black market, we don't know, but in this strange scenario, Hezbollah or Hamas have acquired, like, Russian uh, type Cornet missiles, let's say, to take out an armored personnel carrier or maybe even a tank, right? I mean, that's what they took out, like those Merkava tanks, over a dozen of them, back in 2006, right? That could happen all over again, right? And I think that's the picture that's evolving. Um, because MBS of Saudi Arabia, he's not. I mean, he's not really obeying Biden. Um, he's playing a game not too dissimilar to Erdogan, but
Well, I'm
he
glad you brought
has
that up
in many ways
because
less pressure.
the
Go ahead.
Saudis are actually hardballing the U.S. right now because the demand they're making is in return for recognition of Israel, Saudi Arabia wants American weapons and nuclear technology, according to The Economist. And of course, there has been cooperation with nuclear technology and, of course, weapon shipments for decades now to Saudi Arabia, although the weapon shipments were curtailed as a result of the debacle in Yemen, which is now finally starting to come to a close. But they are becoming more brazen. They realize the Americans have far more desperation, especially when it comes to their position in the Middle East, where in order to sign on to the Abraham Accords in full or bring on any sort of recognition of Israel, they're asking for everything they can get from the Americans at this point. And this is also on top of the negotiations with Iran mediated by the Chinese. So the Saudis are in a very comfortable position right now when it comes to drawing global influence because at this point, I would have thought, I'll put it this way, if the Americans had an ace up their sleeve regime change options for Saudi Arabia, they would have implemented it by now, or if they have implemented it, it failed. Because the situation has
Yeah.
gotten far too out of control in Saudi Arabia for American interests. in order to think that they wouldn't have attempted something already if they had any sort of plan. And I think their moment has passed. I think they thought they could really weave their way through this, especially when Mohammed bin Salman came to prominence. Most just assumed he was going to be their guy, much like his predecessors, but he became a far more renegade force in the region when it came to cooperation with other countries in the region, with Russia, with China, and with just various other countries around the world that aren't necessarily aligned with American interests. You recall about 3 years ago, you had talks of an anti-Iranian coalition being formed among the Arab states, but once again, that's been completely scrapped. We're seeing reconciliation between the two now. And now Saudi Arabia, I don't think they'll actually go through with recognizing Israel. I just don't see that happening. But ultimately, they are in a position where they can make more and more absurd demands. I think, much like you said, Erdogan is the right way to look at this, where able to just play both sides for really an undefined amount of time, for an indefinite period of time, because nobody's going to make a move against Saudi Arabia right now because the situation is so volatile. Nobody wants to run the risk of turning the country completely against their power block, so they're going to live with the status quo and try to maneuver through that.
Hmm. Yeah. I think that's brilliant what you said, by the way, that if there was going to be a coup against MBS, it would already have happened by now because the situation is just it's too out of control for the Americans. I think it's hilarious that the Saudis should ask for nuclear technology. Like that is so funny. That's basically a euphemism. Like you will recognize Israel, but we get nuclear bombs. It makes recognition of Israel null and void, essentially, in their eyes, in the American eyes, and in the Israelis, right? And that really is a worst case scenario. Suppose America says no, right? Like, well, I mean, I'm not saying Iran would do something because I don't think Iran fully trusts Saudi Arabia to that degree. But you have to wonder, and the world is changing very rapidly. In 5 years, someone else might, right? Like Russia is very much a leader in nuclear technology. They're building like a huge nuclear power plant in Turkey right now, right? Um,
They're also
we don't
cooperating with the
know.
Iranians on nuclear technology, as well as about half a dozen other nations too.
Yes, that's right. And really, to be honest, like Saudi Arabia has the wherewithal to acquire this information, through some kind of a black op. They can do that. It- I think that's very much within their capabilities. The idea that Saudi Arabia just has no idea how to make one of these things or wouldn't know who to speak to in order to make like a nuclear power plant in Saudi Arabia, that seems just unfathomable to me. But they're asking for it in a way just to, I don't know, just to sort of take the piss out of the Americans. That's what it sounds like to me.
I would certainly agree with that. Is just a it is a bold move they can make for the sake of making it, for the sake of really, I would say, making the Americans look like fools, making them look weak, and just embarrassing them on the world stage because they're in the position where they can really just do that. They can browbeat them, and maybe if they don't get the nuclear technology from the Americans, they'll probably get a pretty substantial concession from the Americans as a result of these current negotiations. I'll just put it that way. And that, once again, all the bargaining power in the world is theirs. But keep in mind, this is also the same country where Mohammed bin Salman will reject Biden's phone calls and also refuse to increase production or manipulate the oil prices in any way, and it's in complete cooperation with the Russians. That, I mean, keep in mind, OPEC was formed as a cartel in order to offset the massive Soviet oil market. And now you
Hmm.
have Russia on great terms with OPEC, and they cooperate on almost every issue. The Americans have lost complete influence over any global oil prices, and I mean, at this point, what else? What else can they do?
Yeah.
That they've squandered everything. They have
Hmm.
the American policy in the Middle East. While it did serve to some benefit of the Zionists, even that is debatable looking at the position Israel is in now. But the
Hmm.
past 30 years of American policy in the Middle East has been all for nothing. It has been completely in vain if we're going to look at the position and the influence the U.S. holds in the Middle East now. I mean, what is left? The Fifth Fleet in Bahrain? That's the last remnant of American presence in the region. Sure, there's other smaller military bases. There's the detachments in Jordan, in Syria, and I think even to a degree Iraq. But any military position in the middle, and this is excluding Turkey, because although Turkey is technically Middle East, I'm talking about particularly the Gulf, the Arab, like the heart of the Middle East. Really, the last substantial asset they have there is the Fifth Fleet, and that's just a saber rattle against the Iranians. But once again, we've seen, and if you're going to believe the Millennium Challenge 2002, the Iranians can sink the Fifth Fleet in 12 hours in 2002. What makes you think they couldn't do it in even less in 2023? Now, what would the consequence of that look like? But point being is, I believe the Americans have been successfully deterred from any sort of direct military confrontation with Iran. It's just out of the question right now. And
Yeah.
their influence in the Middle East has completely waned. Even when it comes to Egypt, Egypt is no longer a steadfast American ally, as maybe one would have thought in the late Cold War, post Cold War era. I mean, at that point, the Egyptians are far more aligned with the Russians. Although it isn't the most monumental decision, the Egyptians withdrew recognition of Kosovo, which that's certainly setting themselves
Yeah.
against the American. And this is a Muslim nation too. And keep in mind, Kosovo and a lot of what happened in the breakup of Yugoslavia was supposed to be this moment of Islamic unity, but now you have one of the world's largest and most influential Muslim nations withdrawing that recognition from Kosovo, and it, it just shows the degree of realignment.
That genuinely surprised me.
I yeah, me as well. I On the surface, there was no reason not to just maintain status quo because once again they were on decent terms with the Russians. They had growing relations with China. Not that Kosovo is the big sticking point that it once was, but once again, it shows the direction that quite literally the most blatant NATO-backed secessionist project was rejected by, at one point, a country that at one
Yes.
point would have been considered a key American partner. Maybe not ally, but a key American partner, a country that we give $5 billion a year to. And once again, that's also to offset their any potential issues with Israel and also maintain the access to the Suez Canal. And who knows? We could get a scenario as the world goes into even more of a divided situation, as the world becomes more polarized, where control of the Suez Canal, it's under the control of the Egyptian national government, can be something that is heavily controlled. They could deny ships, maybe not outright deny them, but they can harass American vessels, they can harass British vessels, they can harass whoever they want, and nobody's going to try to make any brazen moves against Egypt at this point. That's far less of a priority. So, once again, we could have that challenge to, especially when it comes to American naval power. Suez Canal is vital. We could have the Egyptians completely leverage that as well. And to the point where, and also look at Turkish attitudes towards Americans post 2016. Atrocious, horrible.
Yeah.
There's no public support for any sort of American aligned movement there. Sure, you have Incirlik, you have the other air base there, but at the end of the day, keep in mind the even in 2003, the Turks didn't let the Americans use Incirlik to strike targets in Iraq. It's to the point where if there's any sort of substantial conflict either in Russia, with Russia, or in the Middle East that would require American air power to take off from Incirlik, do you think they're going to get the clearance to take off from Turkey? Absolutely not.
Yeah.
It's that is again they're just prisoners on the airbase at that point. It's functionally worthless having any forces in Incirlik or in Turkey at all, because that ship has sailed. I don't know. Maybe we'll get some sort of reversal of policy. Maybe there'll be some sort of color revolution in Turkey that brings in a completely pro-Western, pro-European government into power that will finally let Sweden into NATO, because that is the most pressing issue of our day, as we know, with the Vilnius summit. And I can imagine that Turkey has the potential to turn the Vilnius summit into a complete PR disaster, and I'm kind of hoping for it. Like, look, say what you will about Erdogan, I've made my thoughts abundantly clear. But if he is just the most bombastic, ridiculous caricature of himself that he can be next week in Vilnius, that could be just a complete blemish on the record of NATO. And I would love nothing more than to see that.
I foresee a Prigozhin Erdogan bro film, like road trip.
That is, that's a prediction.
But kidding aside, Iran is today officially a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, and BRICS now has stated that they will be working on a new gold-backed currency. So yeah, the de-dollarization is happening, which leads me to believe that the euro will lose more and more worth, and Europe will become more and more a poorer continent. And it's kind of hard to imagine that the Americans will be able, although I in no way discounted. I just find it hard to imagine. That's very different than I don't believe it's possible. That they can, whip up let's say, the Romanians, the Lithuanians, and the Poles to go fight in Ukraine. I mean, we're going to find out, but I don't know what's this incentive going to be, because, like, really, the longer and bloodier that this war gets, I think, the less public support there will be for directly getting involved in the war. That's not the same thing as, like, yeah, we'll send them arms, or yeah, we'll send them money to buy arms, or we'll send them money to buy humanitarian aid, or we'll send the humanitarian aid ourselves. Um, but who knows? Conscription for joining World War II apparently was not going well amongst the Americans, which would mean, like, I mean, Pearl Harbor was a kind of a false flag. They moved the Americans moved their navy to Pearl Harbor just 6 months before the attack,
While taking
from their base in San Diego.
every
What's
traditional
that?
saber rattling move as they moved their fleet into Pearl Harbor, escalated completely with Japan, and put it in a prime position to be struck.
Yes, yes, that was yeah, the whole point.
Which it does make you wonder that in the case of greater involvement, which piece are they willing to sacrifice in order to drum up a similar response to Pearl Harbor? And the question is also, would that work? Would some alleged Russian strike on a an American military installation in Europe lead to that effect? Would they fake something, I don't know, maybe in Alaska on the west coast where Russian missiles are well within range? I don't know. I really don't know. Or will they find some other way to completely just derail the situation in order to make it look like the Russians provoked America and not vice versa in order to get deeper involved in this conflict? Because once again, that's not out of the realm of possibility at all. I don't think any of you should really doubt this at this point. But although they were much lower stakes, I think some of the things that we've seen with Iran and Syria in the past 5 years show that the American capability for a false flag has fallen tremendously. It's not what it used to be. They're not
Yeah,
able to drum up the same sort of support and outrage that they did, like I said, even just 5 years ago when we were on the brink of war with Iran and Syria at separate points. And I know we were talking about how Americans usually do fall in line and usually are willing to trust their elites in times of crisis, but you do have to wonder when it comes to something so brazen, will that raise enough alarm bells? Because, again, you don't need the majority of the population to doubt something. You just need a significant minority to doubt something in order for it not to work. You just need that
Hmm.
stubborn, I would say, look, I'm going to cast a wide net here about that stubborn 10 to 30% of the population just to doubt something. And you could make the argument that is what did COVID in. That's what did a lot of the COVID narrative in, is that while they were able to stretch it out for however
Hmm.
long they did, you still had that significant vocal minority of the population that would just question it day in and day out. Had some support among the political class, of course. They had their connections, maybe. Look, think what you will about somebody like him, but somebody like a Ron DeSantis pre-presidential campaign who was really a figurehead, a rallying point for something like that. But once again, you just need a significant minority of the population in order to derail a propaganda or a PR campaign like that. And the question is, would they be able to drum that up in the event of a Pearl Harbor-esque false flag? I genuinely do not know, but I think once the reality of war, and I'm not talking like an Iraq war, an Afghanistan war, or even a Vietnam war, I'm talking like a World War II war, once that reality is faced by the American public, how many of them, with their lives and the livelihoods on the line, and the lives of countless family and friends, will look at this and still want to go along with it? I'm not sure. America was a much more coherent nation in 1941 and 1942 than it is, of course, in 2023. And while they may look for some sort of rallying point, I think that also has the potential to unleash complete political chaos if the Americans were to ever mobilize for another full scale war effort. I don't think that the American state has the capability to do that at this point. Now, I could be proven wrong. Perhaps I'm being too optimistic about this, but I really don't see the American state's capability to mobilize a war effort on the economic, cultural, and military level.
Uh, yeah, you get a sense of that, and I think in many ways, people's minds about America were finally changed by its departure, its retreat from Afghanistan, right? Like you mentioned, 5 years ago, there was still this possibility, could they go? I mean, they're in Syria, but we're talking about a much bigger presence, right? And their presence in Iraq has been greatly diminished as well. But I think leaving Afghanistan, in a sense, that's established a kind of a new era. Whether that you describe that era as just preparation for the war in Ukraine or just a future war, in the Asia Pacific versus China, um, nonetheless, there is a shift, right? And that's we've been talking about the fighting that's been going on in Israel and the state of affairs for Israel. That too is the reason these things are happening is because there is a sense that America is slowly departing or greatly reducing its significance in the Middle East. Because there are other theaters that are opening up, and it simply can't be in all these places the way it could be 30 years ago, 20 years ago.
And I think you bring up a crucial point with the legitimacy of the American state after Afghanistan, where, and I think it also goes both ways, where the Americans are eager to reassert themselves, but also understand that you can't recover from such an embarrassment so easily. And really, what else can be done? Can they try to really just force their way into this? Once again, the situation is so volatile. I can't think of a better word to
Hmm.
describe that just
Hmm.
altogether. But this situation in particular is so volatile because what we have here is something that the same decision made within 12 hours of each other can have a polar opposite effect. If we're to do something 12 hours sooner or 12 hours later, it could be completely successful beyond all expectations, or it could be something as cataclysmic as the fall of the Soviet Union, if we're being honest. That is how
Hmm.
volatile this situation has gotten. And look, I know people think these things is glacial, rightfully so, but I believe we're at the point where in the next 6 months, from now until the end of the year, the number of things that could go
Yeah.
completely off the rails, whether that's in the US, whether that's in Europe, whether that's in Russia, whether that's in the Middle East, there's too many to keep track of, and it's arguably an inevitability. One of these will go off the rails. One of these will kick something once again cataclysmic off, and
Hmm.
I don't know which one it will be. I don't know what exactly we're looking at in those terms, but things, while they might, once again, nothing ever happens. I know, but
It's always happening.
again, it is always happening. It's always happening. It's never happening, but it's reaching a breaking point, and
Hmm.
really somebody is going to have to fire the first either figurative or literal shot that just sends the whole thing tumbling down. And how will the pieces shake out? Once again, I would need to know more information. I would need to know what the exact instant that starts to unravel all of this is, um, because look, I'm sure you know I'm no great supporter of the American empire, NATO, all of that nonsense, but I do have a looming sense of pessimism that they might do something drastic that preserves their position for the next 50 to 100 years, and that honestly makes the world a much darker place. But there's also equally the potential that the weight of their mistakes and of everything they've done over the past century
Hmm.
piles up to the point where it can no longer sustain itself, and it gives way to something new and potentially better. Because what we're looking at right now, in my assessment, is we continue down this path. We have NATO unleash its figurative and literal nuclear options, and there's no chance of anything getting better. Or that system gives way, it implodes, and there's a 5 to 10% chance of things getting better. And that's my assessment right now. I'm generally pessimistic regardless of the outcome, but I'm just saying one outcome invokes far less pessimism in me than the other one.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, even the American empire is far too divided. Like they could have all kinds of new supporters if it actually like I mean it's too late to put away the woke. Now, it was tepidly suggested that some things will be done in order to gain support for the war, but it won't be serious. But if America, if it wanted to regain some of its status, it would just have to put that away. But Zog forces in America are very strong, and the anti-ethnic nationalist approach that was developed, after World War II and the emergence of America's predominance in leadership, there have been just too many decades that have been invested in this, right? That they can't turn it around now. I don't believe it. They would go through a civil war if that happened. I don't know. But like, we've been talking about how more and more actors in the Middle East are, chipping away at American power. Just today, Russian Su-35s, or no, I think it was 2 days. No, yesterday, the Russian Su-35s were harassing Reaper drones, the MQ-9 American Reaper drones flying over Syria. Now, it could be that these Reaper drones are actually, they're helping HTS or they're helping one of these other jihadi groups. It could be that they're just monitoring the situation and that's not what they're doing, right? We don't know. But the Russians, their planes are like flying up to these Reaper drones, flying just in front of them and putting on their afterburners. Or the footage is wild. Or they're dropping these I guess they're like heat sinking I don't know what they are. They're some kind of a flare with a parachute. It's to cause not hit the plane, but to hit these little flares, and they're dropping them just directly in front of the Reaper drones, so that the Reaper's navigation is confused.
They're quite literally, in the classical sense of the word, trolling them.
They are trolling them. And remember, 3 4 weeks ago, the Russians have been hitting targets inside the green, that map of Syria, inside the U.S. controlled space. The Russians are now beginning to take out targets that they consider legitimate with their Air Force. Their Air Force is now beginning to work more closely. There's some drills that they will be practicing with the Syrians. Um, I know the Israelis, frequently hit targets that they say are Iranian targets in Syria, and they have, from time to time, very unfortunate results for Syrians, even Syrian civilians and soldiers that have really very little to do with that. But there was an attack last week where most of the missiles were repelled. Like, Russia has an escalation ladder in Syria, and that will be more, better training of Syrian forces, and they will sell at discount prices more, um, uh, more air defense systems. And if things, continue to go well, they may do that with Lebanon because, well, not Lebanon, but let's say Hezbollah, right? It, I think Israel understands this, right? And I've been saying for quite a while, like, I mean, how did these Palestinians force these Israeli helicopters to make emergency landings, before they were engulfed in flames? Like, I can't believe that that's just an AK-47. I mean, it's possible, but I can't believe that it's just that. And
No.
I kept saying that they're eventually going to get their own air defense systems of some kind. Now, it could be just Stinger, and they only have like a small radius, it's like less than 20 kilometers. I get it. But this is a theater of war that's very concentrated. It's very urban. So, you know, if the Israelis are forced to fly low, and that's ideal for these systems. But it's possible that the Russians sell a system to the Iranians that the Iranians then sell to Hezbollah. Right? It's possible, and I think that's a scenario that I think Israel considers is a potential, right?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's an inevitability more than anything. And depending on the direction of the Lebanese state, depending on who actually ends up in power, I know that the power division in Lebanon is very artificially put in place from top down, where it comes to certain ethnic and religious groups have certain degrees of representation, certain ones that hold certain offices, etc. But as we've seen with the shift in the Middle East in particular, and the world as a whole, when it comes to these ethnic and religious divisions, they're becoming less pronounced in many of these agreements and cooperations, particularly led by Russia and China. So we could see a situation where a Lebanese government that isn't necessarily Hezbollah aligned is seeking air defenses from the Russians and seeking military shipments from the Russians as well. It's not unheard
Mhm.
of, especially if Israel does become more unhinged, if Israel does become more brazen with its actions in the regions, which it inevitably will because they're running out of options. So, as that happens, you can expect, probably not only from that, but from Lebanon, but from other countries in the region as well, especially neighboring. I would say pretty much all of them except the Jordanians, because the Jordanians, once again, just American base of operations at that point, are probably going to be in the market for Russian and or Chinese arms shipments at that point. And keep in mind, a lot of these are former American markets. A lot of these places were hotbeds of American military aid and dumping grounds for last generation equipment. I mean, Ukraine has filled that role for dumping ground for last generation equipment, but when it comes to all of this, what we're looking at is a far more Russia's getting a far more appealing image on the world stage outside of the West and NATO. I think is really what all of this comes down to, and that will continue to increase as American influence continues to decline in the Middle East. You will see Russia and China fill that void. And once again, this is just really obvious stuff, but especially when it comes to the arms shipments, and once again, to return to the point I was making, as Israel becomes far more brazen, we're going to see far more of this, and it's really just going to be a cycle that feeds into itself. And the question is, how long can Israel keep up with this game? Are they so arrogant where they think the Americans will continue to bail them out time after time? I think that remains to be seen, but ultimately, when it comes to cataclysmic events, we're on the horizon of one in the Middle East as well. And it really just takes one of these, to repeat myself once again, one of these to start to unravel for all of them to start to unravel. And I guess we'll see the ultimate consequences of that after a certain point. You can only really speculate, but that's all I had for the topic of the Middle East. And if you have any other topics you'd like to bring into the show, certainly. But if not, I've covered everything I had on the agenda.
Oh, I will just say this, that I guess we'll just this might be the last time we bring up Prigozhin, but photos have surfaced of his pad in his home in St. Petersburg, and there's all. I think a lot of this, I don't know what to think of it, because they have wads of cash lying around, $1 million. Maybe they found cocaine, but they also
No,
have
no,
like
that
a
was the
room
White
with
House.
but they also have a room with all these icon paintings and a military jacket with medals on it. And there's all this talk about him flying from Belarus back to St. Petersburg, back and forth. Just because a plane does that doesn't mean he's on it. Now, I will say, I just wanted to mention that Semyagog did have a very interesting video about why he believes this whole thing was a psyop, and that the question of why would Russia do this? Why would Putin do this? Does not reflect on the situation. In other words, maybe this is what was called for. Maybe it wasn't like, why would you do this? This is hurting you. Doesn't really explain the situation, because it could be that it was the least worst option, right? That that was his take. It was very persuasive, but also the guys, Dmitry and Conrad, have a different take on on um, on the whole Prigozhin thing. Um, that has different conclusions. That's also very much worth listening to. Both these podcasts were really, really good. Well, I mean, there were videos, especially Semyagog's was a live stream from a few days ago. Anyways, if you want to check them out, I don't I'm not 100% either way, to be honest. I think there's many things about the Prigozhin saga that to me makes no sense at all. Um, you know, I don't know what to, we've already gone over this material, so I don't want to go over it again. You can listen to the last three shows, including the one with Geo, and it's the same points, and it's points that everybody else has brought up. I do. I think what's emerging is there was. It's obvious now that there was. If Prigozhin, kind of lost his mind and decided to do this incredibly bold and flamboyant move on his part, um, then the Russians were aware of it for a long time and also allowed it to happen because that served other purposes. Um, Remember what we said at the beginning of the show with the Bakhmut front? Bakhmut wasn't a place that the Russian MOD wanted, but after Prigozhin and Wagner convinced them to take it, you can see what an effect it had on the morale of the Russian troops and the Russian people. So, one could have a counter argument and say, well, how are they going to shoot them? These guys are heroes. And when they went to Rostov, of course, people exclaimed their love for both Putin and Wagner, for both. So, I just thought that was interesting, and you know, you, Poland now has got new conscription posters at their bus stops. Wagner is in Belarus. We have to stop them. Like Poland is the shield of Europe. Poland is the shield of Europe, and Europe creates Polish jokes. Yeah, I know.
That's it's so underappreciated. Nobody does more for Europe than Poland, believe me.
It's just, that's another thing. It's so sad. Like them and the Ukrainians, like they do this kind of Euro simping that's so sad. Like, Ukrainians kneel down on one knee when, a fallen Ukrainian soldier passes through, as if it's like, the German knights are passing through, or the German Nazis are passing through. So you show this. This is not a Slavic tradition. Like I don't know any Slavic group that does this. But they do it, and it has this kind of sad simping quality. They want to demonstrate to all of Europe, how crucial and important they are, and Europe just historically looks at them as cannon fodder, um, useful in one way or another. And it's just sad and funny that after so many centuries they still don't get it.
I mean, it's to be expected, and ethnic grievances will, of course, dominate their minds for the foreseeable future, and especially in the case of Poland. And
Hmm.
the shield of Europe is actually an accurate term, but they're forgetting part of that. The human shield of Europe is what it comes down to, really. The
Yes,
meat
yes,
shield of
yeah.
Europe, and
The meat shield of Europe.
that's really all it is. And what for the past 2 centuries, I would say that since the Polish fall from greatness with the dissolution of the Commonwealth and partition,
Mm.
several Europeans, and I particularly call to mind Napoleon and his campaigns, and also the Germans World War One, are probably the two biggest examples of this. But there's other ones. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
Of the Poles just being complete meat shields thrown into this with some promise of great glory that you'll have a free and independent and strong Poland if you just do our heavy liftings on the front lines for us. If you are just loyal enough subjects to the empire, eventually Poland will be great again. And I also, particularly World War One, I think of where one of the key promises made to the Poles in the German Empire was independence, was a sovereign Polish state out of defeated Russian lands. And
Yeah.
that was something they promised them. Once again, this is a promise that has been made to Poles for centuries now, that to the point where, yes, the Poles do technically have a sovereign state now. How much of one is highly debatable. But they'll keep falling for this time and time again and keep charging into this only to their own detriment, only to their own destruction, and only to the mass amount of deaths and suffering to their own people. Trying to recapture really this glory, trying to rebuild the
Hmm.
Commonwealth, this fantasy of the Commonwealth, which I'll remind you was once referred to by the Jewish populations as Paradisus Judaeorum. It was Jewish paradise. That's and I'm not saying that. The Jews at the time said that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was the paradise of the Jews. So that's. I'm not saying that to cast any moral judgment or aspersions. That's just a interesting historical fact I think you should all know. But
Yeah,
point being
Britain
is,
says, "Hold my beer."
but point being is, when it comes to that, and I think Poland is a preeminent example, but they're not the only example. They're fed these promises of greatness that they take time and time again, only to face the same result because of. Look, I'm not saying you should completely forsake your past. I think it's very important to look at what your ancestors accomplished, honor them for that, and also equally as much learn from their mistakes, which I think is the key thing that Poland is not doing right now. They're not learning from the mistakes of their ancestors. And look, am I saying the Poles should bend over backwards to the Russians? No, no. I don't think that. Uh, once again, I
Yeah.
think we're getting to the point where they're bending over backwards to the West. At which point, what's the difference? There is no difference at that
Yeah.
point. And Poland, I
Well, they
believe,
have
is.
elections coming up.
Oh, really? When are
Yeah,
those?
and PIS is going to definitely put immigration. They're going to have a reform about this new deal that they're supposed to accept 400,000 r refugees, migrants, immigrants, whatever you want to call them, 400,000 a year, and none of them originate from European countries. So that's going to be very interesting to watch. Like you notice how like even with everything that they're doing and facilitating on behalf of the U.S. for Ukraine, um, they're still being taken advantage of. They
Hey,
still
now
have to.
maybe if they just burn a few Qurans, that will just stop mass migration altogether. Because that's how it works
Uh,
in Sweden.
yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
look. I'm not gonna like sit here and say like, oh, I feel such great sympathy for the Muslims or Islam or anything. But point being, it's such an impotent move. It accomplishes nothing.
Yeah,
It,
yeah, yeah.
all that ends up is you end up getting scorned by the European Union and pretty much everyone else in the world. I mean, even like once again, think what you will about it. I mean, but even the Russians condemned it, saying, "Oh, tisk tisk tisk, you haven't done that," and you can attribute that to rhetoric, whatever. I don't really care what the reason was, but point being is, again, it's just impotent, and you don't do anything to further your cause. But I don't know. It's just reminiscent of just the very ineffective conservatism and right wing of the early 2000s, and I don't know, it just bothers me
Yeah,
because once again they think they're accomplishing something great when once again nothing is being accomplished by this, and it's just like
yeah.
how long are
I
they
mean,
going?
thank God they're not being thrown in prison the way
Yeah,
they are in
yeah,
Britain. I get it. That's great, but like you're not going to force like the hand of your politicians because your politicians aren't sovereign actors.
no, not at all,
You
and
know,
it's
ultimately they don't understand that. Like you are much deeper in the American empire than you can imagine. Like and your leaders are answer to them, not you.
yes, it's there's no reasonable solution to get out of that, and
Yeah, I don't know. I've never been so black-pilled about the future for Europe and the West, to be totally honest.
yeah, I mean, look, as much as I say a lot of inflammatory rhetoric, in which case I do believe some of it genuinely. A lot of it is just inflammatory, as I'm sure you all know. Ultimately, I live in the West. I have to live with the consequences of Western decline, even if I just despise the system that we're under now. Point being, yeah, it's bad, but it's probably going to get worse. And look, as much as I think that overall the American empire does need to end and that it is a global threat to everyone of every walk of life. It's not going to be a fun and easy process, and it's also,
And it may not end.
yeah, it may not end. There's also that,
Yeah.
and Once again, whether the American Empire goes in a direction I like or don't like, unless I completely pack up and leave, in which case there's only a few places you can go in the world that are mostly free of the influence of the empire. Like you're going to emigrate most places in Europe when you're just under a much more peripheral control. I mean, and that might be preferable. It might ease the pain of it, but still, you're
Mm,
gonna still be under that. I don't know if you go to Russia or China, maybe both of which are not exactly the easiest size to assimilate to for a Westerner, if we're being honest. Uh,
yeah.
but at the end of the day, we have to live with the consequences of the American empire, whether we live in the American heartland, Europe, or really just
Hmm.
anywhere else in the world that, once again, is not Russia or China or a handful of other nations. Even them, they are going to be affected by the degeneration of the American empire. I'm not even going to necessarily say implosion because I don't think it's a foregone conclusion yet, but yeah, I agree with you. It's never been more, for lack of a better term, blackpilling, and they like things are going to get markedly more difficult, just even on a day-to-day level. And
Mm,
your supposed leaders are not going to do anything to ease that burden. In fact, they're going to press down on that burden, especially if you're of certain social, ethnic, and racial classes. They're not going to reach out a hand to you. It's not going to happen. And in fact, in many cases, they will probably punish you for their shortcomings. They will scapegoat you. And look, I can repeat all the same things I've repeated over and over again, but ultimately, there's only so much you can do politically, and at the end of the day, it's about securing your personal position in order to weather this storm the best you can, because you're not going to escape it no matter where you go. Even if you do go to some of these parts of the world that are more insulated from the American Empire, they're still in the periphery of it. They're still going to feel the aftershocks at least. So
yeah.
whether you do stay in your homeland, whether you're American, Canadian, any flavor of European, or whether you choose to emigrate to somewhere, whether you have connections there, or whether you decide to start a new life there, you're going to be impacted by this on a personal level in some way, shape, or form, even if it's just economic hardship, and that's for the lucky ones of us.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, no matter what you decide to do, I'm not advising you do one thing or another. Just make sure you cushion yourself. Make sure you have a backup plan. Make sure you make contingency plans for when things inevitably go wrong. Once again, particular to your situation, some people might need some things that other people don't. But and well, some people will need certain things other people don't. But like I said, the only advice I can give in this is not political, but I'm just saying, regardless of the situation, make a plan and have backup plans, and just have a general idea of how you are going to weather any number of hardships, whether that be just from basic economic crisis to the nukes might fly, really, if we're being just completely frank about it.
I know. I know. Especially when you think like after a year and it's revealed that that America isn't able to supply enough shells. I mean, they got enough for this offensive, but it will run out by the end of August. And then you wonder, like, so if they are going to go in, and it looks like the conflict will probably last, well more than 2 months. And well, like obviously one side wants to win, the other wants to win as well. How far are they going to go if they can't fight a long, protracted industrial war, right? Anyways, I mean, we don't know. There's all kinds of variables if we ever get to that. Hopefully, we don't.
Hopefully, we don't, but once again, prepare for those possibilities and do whatever you can. And um, it's in God's hands, is really all I can say. And that might not
Yeah,
be a very satisfactory answer for maybe our more irreligious listeners, which, I mean, look, I'm not going to spend this program trying to convince you. There's people who are much more well equipped for that. If you want recommendations, certainly message me. I'll get them to you. But ultimately, I can say with where I stand, with where you stand, where most of our audience probably stands, it's in God's hands, and it's going to get worse
yeah,
before it gets better.
yeah,
But that's all I had for this episode.
yeah. Same here.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.